If you're having a good time listening to Bradbury 100, please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101. And don't forget to visit my website at bradburymedia.co.uk. This is Bradbury 100, celebrating the life and works of American writer Ray Bradbury. Hello and welcome once again to Bradbury 100. Particular thanks to those who've supported the show with 5-star reviews, which does do wonders for the visibility of the show, by the way, and helps keep the audience growing, which is always good. And thanks also if you've used the tip jar on my website at bradburymedia.co.uk. All very much appreciated. Today I have an interview, and it's been quite a while since I had one of those. If you're a long-term listener, you may remember that was originally the focus of this podcast, interviews with people who knew Ray Bradbury, worked with him, or were inspired by his work. So in a way, this episode is getting back to basics. The interview is with Orty Ortwein, author of a delightful book called FIRST GEEKS. Its subtitle is Ray Bradbury, Forrest Ackerman, Ray Harryhausen, and the Founding of Science Fiction Fandom, which tells you right there most of what you need to know. But if you want a little bit more of a hint, it's all about how those three men were there right at the beginning of organised fandom, the creation of fanzines, the establishment of the Science Fiction League, the creation of the first science fiction conventions and fan groups. Today we kind of assume that fandom has always been there, but it hasn't. It had to start somewhere. And where it started was the United States, of course, largely under the influence of one Hugo Gernsback, the guy who the Hugo Awards are named after. Gernsback was mad keen on inventions and visions of the future, and he started publishing technical magazines about radio and television. This was way back in the 1920s, before there really was much radio or television. He started writing and publishing futuristic fiction, and eventually he launched Amazing Stories, the first magazine ever to be devoted entirely to science fiction, which he called scientifiction. It's a very difficult word to say. It looks better in writing, where you can clearly see that what he's done is smashed together the words scientific and fiction. Scientifiction, you see. Yes, well, that was never going to catch on, was it? Apparently, it was soon abbreviated to STF and pronounced Steph by those in the know, but fairly rapidly it was superseded by another term which Gernsback coined, the term we use today, science fiction. When you hear my interview with Orty, you'll learn a bit more about Gernsback and his role in establishing science fiction and fandom, as well as about the three people who are the focus of his book, FIRST GEEKS. I'll just say now that, well, Ray Bradbury should need no introduction, and Ray Harryhausen probably needs no introduction, since many Bradbury fans will know Harryhausen well as the great model animator who created some of the best dinosaurs you've ever seen come to life on screen. Forrest Ackerman, the third person at the heart of FIRST GEEKS, is possibly less familiar. Like the two Rays, he started out as a fan and soon took on various professional roles as writer, agent, editor, publisher. But throughout his life he remained primarily a fan and a collector. Science fiction as a type of literature, of course, predated this period. We can trace it back at least as far as H.G. Wells and Jules Verne in the 19th century, and many historians place Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as the true start of science fiction as literature. But Gernsback and the readers of his magazines from the 1920s onwards were the ones who created organised fandom, science fiction, not just as a genre of literature, but as a movement. Well, these three men, Ray, the other Ray, and Forry, were there at the start of the science fiction movement, and they remained good friends for life. In their final years, when they were all in their 90s, they would still appear together at conventions like San Diego Comic-Con, giving talks and signing autographs for their many fans. As you'll hear in the interview, Orty Ortwein has long been a Bradbury fan. He was also involved in the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum in Ray's hometown of Waukegan, Illinois. The Experience Museum, alas, never came to fruition, but Waukegan's famed Carnegie Library has now been completely renovated and is the new home for Lake County's Historical Museum. It will house some exhibition space devoted to Bradbury. So, please welcome to Bradbury 100, Orty Ortwein, author of The First Geeks.
Thank you. Yeah, but I love your podcast, by the way.
Thank you.
Great work. Yeah.
Now, of course, we're here really to discuss The First Geeks, which is subtitled Ray Bradbury, Forrest J. Ackerman, Ray Harryhausen, and the Founding of Science Fiction Fandom. So what first gave you the idea of writing the book?
Well, as you know, I'm a huge Bradbury fan, and I've done some talks at Comic-Con and elsewhere about Bradbury and his relationships to comics, and I needed something else. And, I picked up through, the Eller and Weller biographies and elsewhere that Bradbury was friends with a lot of people before they were famous. And I just got increasingly, I'm kind of like that. I kind of fall down these rabbit holes. I don't know how much you've Googled me, but this isn't my first obsession. And I just really got intrigued by this idea that Bradbury was friends with a lot of people before they were famous. Ackerman and Harryhausen and Heinlein and a bunch of other men and women. And it was especially fascinating to me the way these people just kind of happened to meet in LA right before the war. And I think LA really needs to promote that more. LA was to science fiction what Paris was to arts and literature in the 1920s. How Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and all those people hung out in Paris together back in the 20s. Well, in the 30s, you've got all these guys and some women just hanging out together who would later have stellar careers in science fiction. And I was just fascinated by that. And then I didn't even know that this whole subculture of what we now call geek culture, what they then called fandom, existed, before the war, and how these people all knew each other and helped each other. It was just really fascinating to me. And I got to look at those zines and everything. I was like, oh, wow, this is so neat. I didn't know any of this. So I just got really intrigued.
I've also sort of dug into the old fanzines and sort of minutes of meetings and so on from the Science Fiction League. And it's something that I always used to stay away from because I used to think, well, I'm mostly interested in Ray as a professional writer sort of after this period. But once I started reading those and then reading his stories alongside, that became really fascinating for me to see how this... Well, he was about 17 or 18 when he joined the society and began to become the writer that we know now.
Yeah, you definitely see the man that he would later become. It's kind of funny how, I think the same way about myself. I always was kind of who I am now, and you see that in those zines. It really is interesting. Definitely.
Yeah. If somebody picks up a copy of the book, what kind of story are they letting themselves in for?
Well, it's a triple deal. You're getting 3 for 1 here. You get 3 biographies. You get Bradbury, Harryhausen, and Ackerman. And I focused a bit more on Ackerman just because he's not as famous as he should be. He really contributed to our culture in a lot of ways, and he deserves to be better known. But it's sort of a 3-in-1 biography, and it's also a story. It begins in Los Angeles in the 1930s. It ends, basically in the early 21st century. So it tells the story of how science fiction fandom came about, why we have conventions and cosplay and all of that. But then tied into that are the stories of these 3 men.
Did you at any point consider writing just about one of these three, or two of them, or more than the three? Or was it obvious that it was always going to be the three?
Pretty much always going to be the three. I feel like, Bradbury, as you know, there's multi-volume biographies about him. There's a lot written about him already. So I really wanted to kind of focus on young Bradbury and young science fiction because they pretty much tie together. So that was always the plan. And, same with Harryhausen. There's multiple books about him. Great books, by the way. Ackerman, like I said, he really, maybe if I were to write one biography, he was probably the one who really, I think, deserves, although I believe there are some biographies in the works right now. But yeah, it was pretty much always going to be the project that I wound up following.
Mm-hmm. So how did you go about doing the research for the book?
Well, that was the fun part, and you can maybe call it fate or karma or something. It so happened for a long time I lived just north of Indianapolis, which, as you know, is the center for Ray Bradbury studies. So that was lucky. I went there a lot, and they were great. I would ask them for letters from Harryhausen or letters from Ackerman, and they would always have them ready. And you've been there, it's a fascinating place. It's really fun. So I went there all the time. I got to sit in Bradbury's office chair, all that fun stuff. So they were great, and the letters are really fun. Ackerman would put all these puns of here. He would call himself the Ackerman man instead of the Illustrated man. And, Harryhausen would sign off as the other Ray. That was always kind of funny. And he also set these, I wish I could have included in my book, but there's all kinds of copyright restrictions. But a lot of times, like the letterhead would be like Clash of the Titans or something with these beautiful drawings of the characters and stuff like that. So that was lucky. And then again, bizarrely enough, by pure coincidence, or maybe it was fate again, I got a job at the Waukegan Public Library. And at that time, they had Bradbury's book collection. So it wasn't necessarily my job, but I would go into the room where they were keeping all that, and I would just look through the boxes, and I came across, gifts from Harryhausen and gifts from Ackerman with their personal signatures on it. And it's really just beautiful. I got to look at a lot of just really neat things. I really hope they make a big deal about that at the Historical Society. So that was a lucky break. And then also, August Derleth, as you know, Bradbury's first agent, his papers are kept at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison, which is not too far from where I live. That's about 3 hours from Chicago. So I went there and I got to look at those letters, and those are fun to read, the very frustrating letters between August and Ray Bradbury. So yeah, that was just kind of lucky. And then I should give a shout out to, fanac.org by Joe Siglari. I think that's how you pronounce it. He has it's a collective that he manages of people, scanning in old zines. So I got to look at a ton of zines from the 30s and 40s, and, you would just see Ackerman and Bradbury popping up everywhere. So that was very lucky. The Ritters have that book, The Earliest Bradbury, which is a beautiful coffee table book. Every Bradbury fan should have one. They saved me a ton of research because they did the legwork and they tracked down all of Bradbury's early zine contributions, all the zines that not only he edited, but he even just contributed to, So that was great. The Las Fas people, LA Science Fantasy Society, they're still around. And I've been talking to them. I'm a member. I got to pay my dues, actually. Got to do that. So they were very helpful as well. So it was really a lot of fun to research. COVID hit. I didn't have a job. I was, for a while, a professional house sitter, which is the best. I felt kind of like Jack Nicholson. I was like house sitting my sister's house in Wisconsin, and that happened to be a really brutal winter, even by Wisconsin standards. So I didn't want to go outside anyway. So yeah, I just worked on my book all day. So it was actually a lot of fun.
Did you actually go to LA to do any of the research?
Yeah. I went to LA. I went to, they still have Clifton's Cafeteria, where the Science Fantasy Society used to meet. That club still exists. So I went there. They have a plaque for them. They even have a couple of drinks named. They have a drink called the Two Rays and a cocktail called the Forry Ackerman, which probably Forry wouldn't appreciate because he never drank. But I had a friend of mine named Michaela who kind of drove me around Ray Bradbury's life, basically. We went to the houses. They moved a few times when he was a young man. I went to their houses and then went to where his house used to be. Unfortunately, it's been torn down. I went to, where his office was. I couldn't actually go in. It's in Beverly Hills. I don't know if it was a COVID thing, but it's very much locked down. I also went to the Bradbury building, which I still want to go inside of. It looks fascinating, but that too is pretty much locked down. I was able to stand outside of it anyway. So yeah, had a good time doing a Bradbury tour of his life. Yeah, it was fun.
I went in the Bradbury building, and it's great because it's like you're in Blade Runner.
Yeah.
It's also like there's an episode of The Outer Limits that was filmed in there as well. So it sort of feels like you're in science fiction heaven.
Yeah, there's even, like, I was watching a really dumb Charles Bronson cop movie called Murphy's Law, which I just recognized it right away. Like, it pops up in a million movies.
Yeah. And I did like the chapter on Clifton's cafeteria, and I found that really quite evocative, the way you described that. Could you describe that for listeners now, what Clifton's cafeteria was like in those days?
So Clifton's was what we now call a theme restaurant. It had like these trees on the inside, fake trees, obviously, although the story I heard was they covered the beams, the support pillars, with like actual bark. So it looked like you were in a forest, and they painted the walls with this kind of forest setting. And it even had a fake waterfall. It had kind of a courtyard on the first floor, and then the levels up, you could sort of see down all the way to the bottom. And also in the basement, because Clifton was actually a devout Christian, he recreated some of the scenes from the Bible in the basement with figures and stuff like that. But there were also a ton of rooms that you could get for free, like these kind of conference rooms. It wasn't just the science fiction fans. A lot of different groups would meet at Clifton's. You can search inside of books on Google. I searched for Clifton's cafeteria, and all kinds of groups came up that would meet there. So it's very neat. And it like I said, it's still there. It's obviously been remodeled since then, but it's definitely worth a visit. You can get a drink there. You can get a Forry Ackerman or the two Rays. It was called Clifton's Cafeteria because actually Clifton himself has his own biography, and it actually is really surprisingly interesting. He would later make it a mission in life to end world hunger. So they had this system where you could actually eat there for free. They used to say, pay only if you're not delighted or something like that. And you could never do that now. But incredibly, that worked. People would honor that.
Mm.
So later, Las Fas would actually get its own clubhouse. And they were really the first science fiction group to do that. But right up until about World War II, they would meet at Clifton's cafeteria.
And it sounds like it was a really great time, sort of between the two world wars there. I don't know how peaceful the world felt at that point. We're talking about the brink of World War II, really. But it sounds like people were having a good time despite the depression. It sounds like a great place to go when you get your time machine to go back there.
Oh, God, yes. Yeah. I mean, they certainly made it seem that way. Like, what I love about that generation is like a common refrain is we didn't know we were poor, They just seemed to have a really good time. Some things were more affordable back then. I mean, even people who with no money could still go to movies because they were like a nickel or a dime. And even if you adjust for inflation, it was like nothing. So that's why they would go to movies a lot. Or, of course, Bradbury would sometimes break into the movie theater. He supposedly knew how to sneak into every movie theater. But yeah, they found pleasure in the simplest of things. And that's just what I love about that whole generation, really.
Had you always been a fan of Bradbury?
Yeah, since I was about 14, that seems to be the age when we discover him. I grabbed my sister's copy of Fahrenheit 451 because that was that beautiful 80s, really pulp cover where Montag is just surrounded by flames and color and books everywhere, the really deliberately pulpy version. I thought that was kind of cool, and I just started reading it, and I think I read it in one sitting or 2 days or something like that. And then, this was before the internet, but I read anything of his I could get my hands on, really. It also so happens I grew up just north of Waukegan in Racine, Wisconsin, which he actually mentions a couple of times in his writing. So that kind of added to the interest.
Were you sort of aware of him as a kind of a celebrity figure as well? Because he was often on TV being interviewed and obviously did lots of public speaking and so on. Were you aware of any of that growing up?
Yeah. I mean, I would have been late junior high school when he did the Ray Bradbury Theater, although we didn't have HBO, unfortunately. I think we did have USA where I would watch it sometimes. So sure. I mean, I knew that he was, right up there with Asimov as just kind of one of those writers from science fiction that, I always say he's kind of like Tiger Woods. If you can't name Ray Bradbury, you probably can't name any science fiction or fantasy writers. But yeah, I was very much aware of that.
What can you tell us about Orty Ortwein? Is this your first book, for example?
Well, it's my first actually published by a professional publisher book. So like I said, I fall down rabbit holes. I self-published a book about bookmobiles, which is super fascinating, I swear. You just punch my name into Amazon, you'll find it. So I self-published that about 10 years ago. It's really just kind of a coffee table book. It's one of those books you can pick up at any point and just read. I also got really bored and self-published a book. Ever since junior high, I've been collecting words that sound offensive but aren't. So like shuttlecock, from... So, I don't know. I basically I had a notebook starting in the 7th grade, and I just kept it going, and I published that as a book. So that's just kind of it's a good Father's Day gift, I swear. It's just like full of seeming swear words. You can call somebody a dyke phobe, but it's not homophobic. Just read my book. You'll know what I mean. So, yeah. So I've always been writing ever since I was a kid, really. I love libraries. In fact, I'm going to be working at a library after this interview. So there's that. I love to ride my bike. I know how to drive, but I love riding my bike.
And have you got any other projects in development after the First Geeks? I mean, are you doing any follow-ups to this? Or
I've got some ideas, nothing solidified. I've kicked around the idea of writing a biography of August Derleth because he discovered Bradbury. He discovered H.P. Lovecraft. He's very much, as they say in Swingers, the guy behind the guy. And he has a very fascinating collection at the Historical Society. He has tons of letters. And so there's that. Or something else, since I live right here, I thought of maybe not a coffee table book, but kind of a book of pictures about Bradbury's childhood, because Waukegan very much influenced his writing. And so I thought about writing about, the Lonely One, the Ravine, the circuses, the library, all of that. If you know Bradbury's life, you know that it keeps turning up in his writing over and over again.
What I found really interesting in the First Geeks, obviously we've had biographies of Bradbury, but this one sort of goes right down some of the cracks in those biographies and pulls out details that you wouldn't have found in there. So, for example, in John Eller's book, I'm sure he talks about Forry Ackerman, but it's only in a very incidental way. And in your book, we get a fairly good account of Forry, and especially the young Forry. So that was sort of filling in some of these little gaps in the existing works, which I thought was really good. Now, I know the three people that you're concentrating on in the book obviously met through the Science Fiction League. Why do you think those three in particular bonded and remained lifelong friends?
Well, in those days, it was very difficult to find other people who liked science fiction. You were, whatever phrases they used back then, a dork or a dweeb or something. It was kind of laughed at. And, there's no internet, obviously. There's no easy way for these people to meet. So when you do meet somebody who has your same taste, you really do kind of glob onto them, I think. And, they also helped each other and really fed each other's careers. I mean, Ackerman really gave Bradbury his start. And the two Rays, Harryhausen and Bradbury, they both loved dinosaurs. Harryhausen was more into fantasy than science fiction, but they loved both. So when you've got this unique thing about you, when you finally find someone else who is a lot like you, I think that makes the bond a lot stronger. Now, of course, there's a million meetup groups and conventions and everything, but that basically didn't exist back then.
That was another really striking part of the book, where you were talking about how people originally made contact with fellow fans, because the professional magazines, when people wrote in a letter, they would publish the full address in those days, which you would never do nowadays.
No, they would sometimes even their phone numbers. It was a very different time. People trusted each other. And first of all, some stranger gives Ray Harryhausen Ackerman's phone number, and Ackerman does not mind at all. And then he invites Ray Harryhausen just to come to his house. He's never met this guy before. So, they would see each other's names and addresses, in Wonder Stories and places like that and magazines. And they would say, yeah, hey, that guy just lives, a couple miles from me. I'm just going to go see him. And in those days, you couldn't, obviously friend someone ahead of time or anything. So the only thing to do would have been to actually just go to their house and knock on the door, which, you would never nowadays just knock on some stranger's door. It was a very, very different time, for better or for worse.
Yeah. But very rapidly, of course, all of those individual fans contacted each other. The groups were networked together into this league that Hugo Gernsback essentially initiated. And then from that, conventions began, and obviously it became a sort of eventually a global network of fans. Can you tell us a bit about Hugo Gernsback's role in all of this?
There's always a debate about when science fiction began, but he literally coined the phrase science fiction. He invented that. And there's some debate about that, but if nothing else, he definitely popularized the phrase science fiction. And he more or less, Amazing Stories was basically the first magazine devoted to science fiction, or what they sometimes called science fiction, or even just Steph sometimes. But so he created modern science fiction as we now know it. And he was the first person to really focus on it as something that you could make money off of just by itself. He had a role in radio. That's what he did for a long, long time. He sold magazines that were devoted to radio. He wrote about and even somewhat contributed to the earliest days of television. So he very much believed that science fiction could make the world a better place, and he really proved that in his own life. And in some ways, it's almost like a religious devotion. Like, he really believed that the more people who read science fiction would get people curious about science. And the more we study science, of course, the better the world is. So if you read some of his writings, it even gets a little arrogant at times. It's like, okay, fine, you can have your silly romances and westerns, but science fiction, that's the genre that's going to save the world. I mean, he quite literally believed science fiction could save the world. So he's a very fascinating person that way. And yeah, he created the Science Fiction League, which was kind of the first nationwide science fiction group, had a hand in the first conventions. So yeah, very much worthy of a biography of himself.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating. Yeah. Do you have a favourite Bradbury book or story or poem? Or
I know a lot of people rightfully poo-poo it, but I've always had a place in my heart for the the late 70s version of the Martian Chronicles, because that probably was my first exposure to Bradbury. My sister rented that when I was like 7 or something, and the story Mars is Heaven freaked me out because I shared a room with my brother at the time, so I didn't sleep for about a week after that. And, just the idea that your family are literally monsters, that every little kid has that fear. So, yeah, I watch it now, and yes, it's cheesy, but I still think it's kind of fun. And my favorite book, I've always liked Something Wicked This Way Comes, because I feel like it combines kind of the two Bradburys, because, there's the sci-fi fantasy Bradbury that's famous, but there's the lesser known, Dandelion Wine Bradbury. I always tell people, believe it or not, if you tally up everything, he wrote more stuff that wasn't fantasy and science fiction. He was a very proudly sentimental writer, and I feel like Something Wicked really combines those two worlds. It's a fantasy story set in Greentown.
When you read Something Wicked, do you really see the real Waukegan in the words and in the descriptions in them?
Absolutely. I mean, it's, Waukegan as he remembered it, because something about Waukegan that you wouldn't know from his writing is it actually was a bustling manufacturing town even back then. And when I read his stuff as a kid, I thought, well, maybe it was a small Mayberry kind of community, but not really. It was actually a pretty bustling town at the time. But it is the way Bradbury remembers it. I guess you figure his childhood world basically was downtown Waukegan. He lived just a few blocks from the movie theater and the library and everything. So I definitely see his world, especially the library. The description of the library is just beautiful. So I'm really hoping that the Carnegie kind of recaptures that. He talks about the smells of the books and getting lost in that world. And as you know, he used to go there all the time as a kid. When you read just about anything of Bradbury, if you read it enough, you'll see Waukegan references. Like, he even mentions St. James Street, I think in Marionette's Inc. or one of those, otherwise nothing to do with Waukegan. So yeah, you see it all the time, really.
Are you happy talking about the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum?
Yeah, I mean, I have no regrets. I had a good time. I met some great people. I am sorry that there is still not a museum devoted to Ray Bradbury. The Waukegan Historical Society will be close to that, but not quite. It's going to be Lake County in general. I'm a little upset because we actually did have it at one point. We got close. And then just for a variety of circumstances, it just didn't quite work out. And I still feel like Waukegan doesn't quite understand what it has. I mean, Ray Bradbury, it's hard to believe anyone more famous is ever going to come out of there. And when I would wear my T-shirt, people would say, "Oh my God, is there a Ray Bradbury museum?" So I still feel like it's a missed opportunity there. But I'm looking forward to the Historical Society, and I've been telling them, like, guys, you got to put a big sign on the front lawn that says Ray Bradbury Museum or something. People will stop. It's right there on Sheridan Road. It's right by the train station. I'm still optimistic that they're going to do great things there.
What was your level of involvement with the museum that would have existed had it come to fruition?
I mean, what I brought to the table was my love and expertise of Ray Bradbury. So I put together some talks. I did some talks online. I also, when I worked at the library, I did a couple of talks where I displayed some of the cooler things in Bradbury's personal book collection. That was my involvement there. Yeah, it's weird. That office building still exists, and they still have like the Martian floor. So I'm sure people go in there and wonder what that's about. So.
Now, when I interview people for this podcast, I usually ask them the desert island question, which is, if you were stranded on a desert island and you could only have one Ray Bradbury thing with you, what would you want to have?
Well, I guess it would be the complete stories of Ray Bradbury, because it's literally all of his stories. And some of them are about people deserted on a planet by themselves, so that maybe I could relate a little bit.
Yeah, you might learn how to escape. You might need to build a rocket to escape.
Yeah. Bradbury was always a little light on scientific details, unfortunately, but
That's true. Yeah. Now, is there anything that you think I should have asked you in this interview?
Not really. I think we pretty much well covered it. So just, for people who are curious, the book is called The FIRST GEEKS, and if I'm literally the only Orty Ortwein in the world, so you can type it into Amazon. It's available elsewhere. You can find it. I'll be hopefully going to Comic-Con San Diego again this year. I've gone the past few years to talk about Bradbury, so looking forward to that. So if anyone's coming to Comic-Con San Diego, just look for my name and we can hang out. So yeah, we can go to Clifton's again.
Excellent. Has the book been selling well?
It's building a following. It's my first professionally published book. I'm very excited. It's published by McFarland. They've actually published stuff on Ackerman and other people as well.
Did you find it a different experience working with a publisher as opposed to self-publishing?
Sure, but in a good way. I forgot to mention him, a gentleman by the name of John Coker III. Most of the pictures in my book are his. He's a first fan expert. He has a huge collection of original photographs and things. So he really critiqued my book and, was very, very critical, but in a good way. He pointed out things I got wrong, mistakes I'd made. So that's very important when you're publishing. They want it to be respectable. And then they're a lot more critical about certain things that I didn't catch so that was great, really. It's always good to have another pair of eyes look at your stuff. So a lot of shout out to Coker and to McFarland. They really made the book what it is.
Very good. And I will say, honestly, it is a very readable book.
Thank you.
But it's got all the footnotes. You've got meticulous referencing of everything that you've located. So it's a very good book. It's solid research, but it's also highly readable.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and definitely don't skip the footnotes, because that was something with McFarland I fought about and lost. I wanted the footnotes at the bottom of the page, and they said a variety of reasons that had to be at the back. So I know it's kind of annoying, but definitely check out the footnotes at the back. There's all kinds of fascinating stuff there.
That drives me mad when I'm reading a book, because I need two bookmarks, one for where I am and one for where the notes are.
Yeah, it wasn't quite how I wanted it, but definitely it'll be worth it. Trust me. Just get that extra bookmark and flip to the back. There's all kinds of great stuff in the footnotes,
Okay. I'm very pleased to have had this chat with you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. It's been an honor. This has been great.
My thanks to Orty for joining me today. Take a look at the show notes at bradburymedia.co.uk, where you'll find purchasing links for the book The First Geeks, and links to a number of things that we talked about today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your pods, and maybe dropping some coins into the old tip jar on my website. That's it for now. I'll see you next time on Bradbury 100. Bradbury 100 is presented and produced by Phil Nichols, and theme music is by Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com. You can find the show notes and much more on Bradbury at bradburymedia.co.uk, and please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101, where we discuss the past, present and future of science fiction. You'll find it wherever good pods are given away.